There's a weapon that changed the course of World War II. A weapon so prolific that over 5 million were manufactured. A weapon that you've seen in countless war movies, but never fully understood. The Soviet soldiers called it the Papasha or Daddy. The Germans called it the Russian Typewriter because of its distinctive sound. This is the story of the PPSh-41 submachine gun, the drum-fed Soviet weapon that absolutely dominated urban warfare. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this forgotten weapon was actually a game-changer. To understand the PPSh-41, we need to go back to the brutal winter of 1939. The Soviet Union had just invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. Soviet commanders expected an easy victory over their smaller neighbor. But the Finns had a secret weapon that shocked the Red Army. The Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. Finnish troops used these weapons with devastating effectiveness in close-quarters forest fighting. They would ambush Soviet columns with overwhelming automatic fire. Soviet soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles couldn't respond fast enough. By the time they worked their rifle bolts, the Finns had disappeared into the trees. The Red Army suffered embarrassing casualties against the much smaller Finnish force. Soviet military leadership took notice of these humiliating defeats. They realized their infantry desperately needed more automatic weapons. The Soviet Union did have submachine guns at the time. The PPD-40 was in limited production, but it was expensive to manufacture and complicated to produce in large quantities. It required extensive machining and skilled labor. Soviet factories simply couldn't make enough of them fast enough. And then on June 22, 1941, everything changed. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. 3 million German troops crashed across the border. The Red Army was caught completely unprepared, despite numerous warnings. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed in the opening weeks. The Germans advanced at an unprecedented pace toward Moscow. The Soviet Union faced an existential crisis. They needed weapons, millions of weapons, and they needed them immediately. This is where our story's hero enters the picture. Georgy Shpagin was a Soviet weapons designer. He wasn't famous like Kalashnikov would later become. But Shpagin understood something that would save his country. He understood mass production. Shpagin had been working on submachine gun designs before the invasion. But when war broke out, his work took on desperate urgency. The Soviet government gave him a seemingly impossible task: design a submachine gun that could be manufactured by the millions. It had to be simple enough that unskilled workers could make it. It had to use minimal resources since factories were being evacuated eastward. It had to be reliable in the harshest conditions imaginable. And it had to be lethal enough to stop the German advance. Shpagin delivered the prototype in record time. The weapon he created was brilliantly simple. The PPSh-41, with PPSh standing for Pistolet-Pulemyot Shpagina, which translates to Shpagin's machine pistol in English. The 41 designated the year of its adoption, 1941. Now, what made this weapon so revolutionary wasn't any single feature. It was how Shpagin combined simplicity, firepower, and manufacturability. Let me break down the genius of this design for you. The PPSh-41 used a simple blowback operation. This is the simplest possible operating mechanism for an automatic weapon. When you pull the trigger, the bolt moves forward, chambering around. The firing pin hits the primer, and the cartridge fires. The pressure from the explosion pushes the bolt backward. The bolt extracts the spent casing, ejects it, and cocks the weapon. Then a spring pushes the bolt forward again to chamber the next round. This cycle repeats as long as you hold the trigger. There are no complex locking mechanisms or gas systems. Just a heavy bolt, a spring, and basic physics. This simplicity meant the PPSh-41 was incredibly reliable. It functioned in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees to extreme heat. It worked when caked in mud, covered in snow, or filled with dust. Soviet soldiers could pour water into the action to clean it and keep firing. The manufacturing process was equally brilliant. Shpagin designed the weapon to use stamped metal parts wherever possible. The receiver was made from 2 pieces of stamped sheet metal welded together. This was much faster than machining a receiver from a solid block of steel. A skilled machinist with traditional methods might take 20 hours to make a receiver. With stamping, an unskilled worker could produce one in under 2 hours. The barrel was one of the few precision components, but even this was simplified using chrome-lined barrels, salvaged from rejected rifle barrels. Nothing was wasted in Soviet wartime production. The weapon's total part count was remarkably low, just 87 parts in the entire weapon, including screws and pins. By comparison, many contemporary weapons had over 150 parts. Fewer parts meant faster assembly, fewer things to break, and easier field maintenance. But here's what made the PPSh-41 truly legendary on the battlefield. The drum magazine. The standard drum held 71 rounds of 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev ammunition. This gave Soviet soldiers an enormous advantage in firepower, while a German soldier with an MP-40 had only 32 rounds in his magazine. A Soviet soldier with a PPSh-41 had 71 rounds ready to go. That's more than double the ammunition capacity. The drum magazine design was borrowed from the Finnish Suomi, the same weapon that had taught the Soviets a painful lesson in Finland. The Soviets learned from their enemies and improved upon their ideas. The rate of fire was approximately 900 rounds per minute. That's 15 bullets every single second. When a Soviet soldier opened fire with a PPSh-41, it sounded like ripping fabric, a continuous stream of lead that could cut a person in half. Now imagine not one, but dozens of these weapons firing simultaneously. That's what German soldiers faced in urban combat. The weight of the weapon was manageable at about 8 pounds loaded. The drum magazine itself weighed about 3 pounds when fully loaded. This meant soldiers could carry the weapon and spare drums without being overburdened. The effective range was about 150 to 200 meters. This was perfect for the close-quarters fighting in cities and forests. Beyond that range, accuracy dropped significantly, but that didn't matter. The PPSh-41 wasn't designed for long-range precision. It was designed to flood an area with bullets at close range. Production of the PPSh-41 ramped up incredibly fast. By the end of 1941, just months after the invasion, factories were producing thousands per week. Soviet factories operated around the clock, with workers sleeping beside their machines. Women, teenagers, and elderly workers assembled weapons while men fought at the front. Many Soviet factories had been evacuated from western regions ahead of the German advance. Entire production lines were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved east. Some factories resumed production in temporary facilities within weeks. The simplicity of the PPSh-41's design made this possible. By 1942, production exceeded 1.5 million units. By the war's end in 1945, over 6 million PPSh-41s had been manufactured. This made it one of the most produced firearms in history. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Denmark at the time. The weapon flooded the Red Army in unprecedented numbers. Entire Soviet infantry units were equipped exclusively with PPSh-41s. This created devastating firepower concentration in close combat. Let's talk about how this weapon changed actual combat tactics. The Battle of Stalingrad is where the PPSh-41 truly proved its worth. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought for every building. The fighting was brutal beyond imagination. Soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes even within the same building. This was exactly the environment where the PPSh-41 dominated. German soldiers with their accurate but slow-firing rifles were at a disadvantage. Their MP-40 submachine guns had smaller magazines and lower production numbers. In a ruined apartment block or factory, when combat happened at 10 or 20 meters, the side with more automatic weapons and more ammunition had the advantage. Soviet assault groups would storm buildings armed primarily with PPSh-41s. They would spray entire rooms with gunfire before entering. The 71-round drum meant they could sustain fire without reloading during critical moments. German commanders noticed the effectiveness of Soviet submachine gun tactics. After-action reports repeatedly mentioned the overwhelming firepower of Soviet close-quarters units. The sound of multiple PPSh-41s firing simultaneously became associated with Soviet attacks. German soldiers called it the Russian Typewriter because of the chattering sound. That sound meant Soviet troops were close, and close combat favored the Soviets. Soviet tactics evolved specifically around the PPSh-41's capabilities. Scout units armed with these weapons would infiltrate enemy lines at night. Tank-riding infantry, called tank descent, carried PPSh-41s exclusively. They would ride on the outside of tanks into battle, then dismount to clear enemy positions. The PPSh-41's firepower was perfect for supporting armored assaults. Partisan units behind German lines also received PPSh-41s in large numbers. Soviet aircraft would airdrop these weapons to resistance fighters. The simplicity meant partisans could maintain them with minimal training. The reliability meant they functioned despite harsh conditions and limited maintenance. German soldiers actually preferred captured PPSh-41s over their own weapons in many situations. Thousands of captured PPSh-41s were put into German service. The Germans designated them as MP-41R, with the R standing for Russisch or Russian. Some were converted to fire German 9mm ammunition, but many German soldiers used them with the original Soviet ammunition. They would scavenge 7.62mm ammunition from the battlefield. German officers tried to discourage this practice. Using enemy weapons created ammunition supply problems and identification issues, but frontline soldiers preferred the PPSh-41's firepower and reliability. This speaks volumes about the weapon's combat effectiveness. Now, the PPSh-41 wasn't perfect, no weapon ever is. The drum magazine, while holding more ammunition, had some drawbacks. It was complicated to load, requiring a special loading tool. The spring mechanism could fail if not properly maintained. Soldiers learned to load drums to only 65 or 68 rounds instead of the full 71. This reduced spring tension and prevented feeding malfunctions. The drum also made noise when partially empty, rattling as the soldier moved. This could compromise stealth in reconnaissance or infiltration missions. Later in the war, the Soviets introduced a simpler 35-round box magazine. This was easier to manufacture, easier to load, and more reliable, but it held far less ammunition than the iconic drum. Many soldiers preferred to keep using drums despite the drawbacks. The psychological advantage of 71 rounds was significant. Knowing you could fire for 8 seconds straight without reloading was confidence-inspiring. Another issue was the weapon's accuracy, or lack thereof, at range. The short barrel and pistol caliber ammunition limited effective range. Beyond 150 meters, hitting a specific target became very difficult. But Soviet doctrine didn't emphasize long-range precision. Soviet infantry tactics focused on getting close and overwhelming the enemy. The PPSh-41 was perfect for this approach. The weight was another consideration, especially when carrying multiple loaded drums. A soldier with a PPSh-41 and 3 loaded drums carried about 20 pounds of weapons and ammunition, plus all their other equipment, grenades, food, and supplies. But Soviet soldiers were remarkably tough and adapted to the load. The firepower advantage was worth the extra weight. Let's talk about some specific battles where the PPSh-41 made a difference. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet infantry armed with PPSh-41s defended against German armored assaults. They couldn't penetrate tank armor, but they could suppress German infantry supporting the tanks. German infantry following their tanks were cut down by massed submachine gun fire. This separated German tanks from their infantry support, making them vulnerable. Soviet anti-tank teams could then approach the isolated tanks. The PPSh-41 indirectly contributed to destroying German armor. During the liberation of Belarus in Operation Bagration in summer 1944, Soviet forces encircled and destroyed entire German army groups. The rapid Soviet advance relied on fast-moving infantry with automatic weapons. PPSh-41 armed troops could quickly clear villages and forest positions. The speed of the Soviet offensive shocked the Germans. In urban combat during the Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945, Soviet assault troops fought through the German capital building by building. The PPSh-41 was the perfect weapon for this final urban battle. Soviet soldiers would spray an entire room before entering. The 71-round drum allowed sustained fire during room clearing. German defenders with bolt-action rifles were at a severe disadvantage. The sound of PPSh-41's firing meant the Soviets were close. And in Berlin, that sound became the soundtrack of Germany's defeat. The PPSh-41's influence didn't end with World War II. After the war, the weapon saw service in conflicts around the globe. During the Chinese Civil War, both communist and nationalist forces used PPSh-41s. The Soviet Union supplied huge quantities to Mao's communist forces. China eventually produced its own copy called the Type 50. This Chinese version saw extensive use in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Chinese volunteer forces armed with Type 50s crossed the Yalu River into Korea. American soldiers encountered these weapons in close-quarters combat. The drum-fed submachine guns proved effective in Korean mountain warfare. North Korean forces also used PPSh-41s throughout the war. The weapon's reliability in cold weather was advantageous in Korean winters. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used PPSh-41s, though by this time the AK-47 was becoming more common. The PPSh-41 still saw action in jungle warfare and tunnel combat. Its close-range firepower remained devastating in confined spaces. Middle Eastern conflicts also saw PPSh-41 used for decades. The weapon appeared in Arab-Israeli wars, supplied to Arab forces by the Soviet bloc. Palestinian groups used PPSh-41s in the 1960s and 70s. Afghan Mujahideen fighters used captured PPSh-41s against Soviet forces in the 1980s. The irony of using Soviet weapons against the Soviet army was not lost on anyone. African conflicts in the Cold War era featured PPSh-41s extensively. Soviet military aid to various African liberation movements included these weapons. Angola, Mozambique, and other nations saw PPSh-41s in their independence struggles. The weapon remained in service well into the 1970s and 80s in some countries. Even today, PPSh-41s occasionally appear in conflict zones. During the Syrian civil war, fighters were photographed with these vintage weapons. The fact that an 80-year-old design still functions is testament to its durability. Now let's talk about the ammunition that made this weapon so effective. The 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge was originally designed for pistols. It was based on the earlier 7.63mm Mauser round. This was actually a quite powerful cartridge for a submachine gun. It had excellent penetration, capable of punching through body armor of the era. It could penetrate German steel helmets at typical combat ranges. The muzzle velocity was approximately 500 meters per second. This was significantly faster than the 9mm ammunition used in German and Allied weapons. The higher velocity gave the round a flatter trajectory and better penetration. Soviet ammunition production was enormous during the war. Factories produced billions of rounds of 7.62 by 25mm ammunition. The standardization meant PPSh-41s and Tokarev pistols used the same ammunition. This simplified logistics significantly. The downside of this powerful cartridge was increased recoil. The PPSh-41 had noticeable muzzle climb when firing full automatic. Soldiers learned to fire in short bursts to maintain accuracy. Experienced gunners could put effective fire on target despite the recoil. Let's compare the PPSh-41 to its contemporaries to understand its advantages. The German MP-40, probably the most famous enemy submachine gun. It fired 9mm ammunition at about 500 rounds per minute. Magazine capacity was only 32 rounds. It was more expensive to manufacture than the PPSh-41. Germany only produced about 1 million MP-40s during the entire war. That's 1/6 the production of the PPSh-41. The American Thompson submachine gun, the famous Tommy gun. It was extremely well made and very reliable. But it was also extremely expensive, costing about $200 in 1940s money. The PPSh-41 cost only about $5 to manufacture by comparison. The Thompson fired 45 ACP ammunition at 600 to 700 rounds per minute. Magazine capacity was typically 20 or 30 rounds, though drum magazines existed. The Thompson drums were unreliable and heavy, so most soldiers used box magazines. The British Sten gun was designed for cheap mass production like the PPSh-41. It cost only about $10 to make, but the Sten was notoriously unreliable and uncomfortable to fire. Soldiers called it the plumber's nightmare because of its crude appearance. It fired 9mm ammunition at 500 rounds per minute with 32-round magazines. The Sten could accidentally fire if dropped or jarred. The PPSh-41 was much safer and more reliable than the Sten. The Finnish Suomi KP-31, the weapon that inspired the PPSh-41. It was actually superior to the PPSh-41 in terms of quality and accuracy. But it was expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. Finland simply couldn't produce them in the numbers the Soviet Union needed. The Suomi used the same drum magazine concept, holding 71 rounds. It fired 9mm ammunition at about 900 rounds per minute. The PPSh-41 took the Suomi's best features and made them mass-producible. When you compare all these weapons, the PPSh-41's advantages become clear. It offered the best balance of firepower, reliability, and manufacturability. No other nation could equip their army with submachine guns like the Soviet Union did. The training for PPSh-41 operators was relatively simple. Soviet soldiers could be trained to basic proficiency in a few days. The simple operation meant minimal training was needed. Load magazine, pull charging handle, aim and fire. Field stripping for cleaning was straightforward. Soldiers could disassemble and reassemble the weapon in minutes. Soviet training emphasized aggressive tactics with the weapon. Soldiers were taught to fire from the hip while advancing. The high rate of fire and large magazine capacity made this viable. The goal was to overwhelm the enemy with firepower and momentum. Soviet doctrine called this shock action. Units would assault with maximum firepower at close range. The PPSh-41 was the perfect weapon for this doctrine. Maintenance of the weapon was minimal compared to more complex firearms. Soldiers were instructed to keep the weapon clean and lightly oiled. But the PPSh-41 could function even when dirty. The loose tolerances actually helped in harsh conditions. Mud, snow, and debris wouldn't jam the mechanism as easily as precision weapons. Soviet soldiers in the field had minimal maintenance equipment. A cleaning rod and some oil were usually sufficient. The weapon's durability meant it could take abuse and keep functioning. The cultural impact of the PPSh-41 in Soviet society was significant. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet resistance against Nazi Germany. Soviet propaganda posters frequently featured soldiers with PPSh-41s. The distinctive silhouette with the drum magazine became iconic. Veterans who carried the weapon held it in high regard. They credited it with saving their lives in countless engagements. The nickname Papasha, or Daddy, showed the affection soldiers felt for the weapon. It was reliable, powerful, and always there when they needed it. In Soviet films about World War II, the PPSh-41 featured prominently. It became part of the visual language of Soviet war cinema. Western films also recognized its significance. Enemy at the Gates, a film about the Battle of Stalingrad, featured the weapon extensively. Call of Duty and other World War II video games include the PPSh-41. In these games, it's typically portrayed as having high firepower but limited accuracy. This reflects its real-world characteristics. For collectors and firearms enthusiasts today, the PPSh-41 is highly sought after. Original wartime examples are increasingly rare and valuable. Semi-automatic versions are available in some countries for civilian ownership. These fire only one shot per trigger pull, not fully automatic. But they retain the distinctive look and feel of the original. Museums worldwide display PPSh-41s in their military collections. The Imperial War Museum in London has several examples. Russian military museums feature them prominently in World War II exhibits. American museums like the National World War II Museum have captured examples. These preserved weapons tell the story of one of history's most produced firearms. The technical specifications tell an interesting story. Overall length was 33 inches, relatively compact for a submachine gun. Barrel length was 10.6 inches, contributing to the weapon's compactness. Weight unloaded was 8 pounds, manageable for infantry. With a loaded 71-round drum, total weight was about 12 pounds. Rate of fire was approximately 900 rounds per minute, or 15 per second. Effective range was 150 to 200 meters for aimed fire. Maximum range was about 500 meters, though accuracy at that distance was minimal. Muzzle velocity with standard ammunition was 500 meters per second. These specifications made it ideal for its intended role. The manufacturing innovations deserve deeper examination. The stamped steel receiver was revolutionary for the time. 2 pieces of sheet metal were stamped, then welded together. This process took a fraction of the time compared to machining. It also required less skilled labor, crucial when experienced workers were scarce. The barrel was chrome-lined for durability. Chrome lining prevented corrosion and extended barrel life. This was especially important given the weapon's high rate of fire. The bolt was a simple machined part, one of the few precision components. But its design was straightforward. making it easy to produce. The wooden stock was simple and functional. Early versions had wooden stocks carved from solid wood. Later versions sometimes used laminated wood or simplified stock designs. Every aspect of the weapon was designed for mass production. The spring mechanism was simple coiled springs. The trigger mechanism was straightforward with minimal parts. Everything was designed to be manufactured quickly and assembled easily. This manufacturing philosophy influenced post-war weapons design globally. The AK-47, designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov in the late 1940s, followed similar principles. Stamped metal parts, simple operation, and ease of manufacturing. Kalashnikov certainly studied the PPSh-41's success. The lessons learned from the PPSh-41 influenced the AK-47's design. Both weapons prioritized reliability over precision. Both used stamping and welding for rapid production. Both became among the most produced firearms in history. The PPSh-41's influence on modern weapons doctrine is still felt today. The concept of equipping large numbers of infantry with automatic weapons. This was revolutionary in the 1940s, but became standard by the 1960s. Modern armies equip every soldier with an automatic or semi-automatic weapon. This doctrine can be traced back to Soviet experiences with the PPSh-41. The emphasis on firepower over accuracy at close range. This tactical approach proved effective in World War II urban combat. Modern close-quarters battle tactics still emphasize overwhelming firepower. Special forces and urban warfare units use similar principles today. The importance of ammunition capacity was demonstrated by the 71-round drum. Modern high-capacity magazines for assault rifles follow this principle. Soldiers want to maintain fire without frequent reloading during critical moments. The PPSh-41 proved this concept in actual combat. Let's examine some myths and misconceptions about the PPSh-41. Some claim the weapon was inaccurate and only effective when fired in mass. While it's true the weapon wasn't a precision instrument, individual soldiers could effectively engage targets within 150 meters. The limitation was the ammunition and barrel length, not poor design. Another myth is that Soviet soldiers were simply given PPSh-41s with no training. In reality, Soviet training programs were extensive. Soldiers received weeks of training on weapon operation and tactics. The weapon's simplicity made training easier, but training still occurred. Some claim the drum magazine was unreliable and constantly jammed. While the drum did have reliability issues compared to box magazines, properly maintained and loaded drums functioned reliably. The key was not overloading them and keeping the spring mechanism clean. Experienced soldiers learned these tricks and had few problems. There's also a misconception that the PPSh-41 was a crude, poorly made weapon. While it lacked the fit and finish of expensive weapons like the Thompson, it was actually well designed and properly manufactured. The simplicity was intentional engineering, not poor craftsmanship. Wartime PPSh-41s that survive today still function after 80 years. That's a testament to the quality of design and construction. The psychological impact of the PPSh-41 shouldn't be underestimated. The sound of dozens of these weapons firing created a unique battlefield experience. German soldiers who faced massed PPSh-41 fire described it as terrifying. The sheer volume of bullets created a wall of fire. The continuous roar of automatic fire was demoralizing. For Soviet soldiers, the weapon provided confidence. Knowing you had 71 rounds ready and could fire 15 per second, this gave soldiers courage to advance into enemy fire. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet firepower and determination. Carrying a PPSh-41 meant you were part of the force driving back the invaders. The environmental testing the weapon underwent was brutal. It was tested in temperatures from -40 Celsius to +50 Celsius. It functioned in snow, rain, mud, and dust. The Eastern Front provided the harshest possible testing environment. Weapons that failed were quickly identified and removed from service. The PPSh-41 passed every test the battlefield threw at it. This reliability wasn't accidental. It was designed in from the beginning. The variants of the PPSh-41 are worth mentioning. The basic design remained consistent throughout production, but minor variations occurred as production methods improved. Different factories produced slightly different versions. Stock designs varied. Some used solid wood, others laminated. Finish quality varied depending on wartime conditions. Early war examples had better finish than desperate late war production, but all variants functioned essentially the same. The Chinese Type 50 was the most significant variant. It was virtually identical to the Soviet original. China produced millions of Type 50s for their military and for export. These weapons armed communist forces throughout Asia. North Korea also produced a copy, though in smaller numbers. The design was so simple that multiple countries could replicate it. The PPSh-41's successor in Soviet service was the PPS-43. This was an even simpler submachine gun designed during the siege of Leningrad. It used a simple box magazine and was lighter than the PPSh-41. But it never achieved the PPSh-41's iconic status. The PPSh-41 remained in Soviet service even after the introduction of the PPS-43. Both weapons served together until replaced by assault rifles in the 1950s. The transition from submachine guns to assault rifles changed infantry warfare. Assault rifles like the AK-47 offered the automatic fire of submachine guns, but with the range and power of rifles. This made dedicated submachine guns less necessary for regular infantry. But the lessons learned from the PPSh-41 influenced assault rifle doctrine. The emphasis on automatic fire, reliability, and ease of production. These principles carried forward into the assault rifle era. For modern military historians, the PPSh-41 represents several important lessons. First, quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin allegedly said. 6 million PPSh-41s created overwhelming firepower superiority. This mass of weapons changed the tactical balance on the Eastern Front. Second, design for manufacturing is as important as design for performance. The best weapon in the world is useless if you can't produce enough of them. The PPSh-41 balanced performance with production reality. Third, reliability matters more than perfection in combat conditions. A weapon that works every time is better than a perfect weapon that fails. The PPSh-41's loose tolerances actually enhanced reliability. Fourth, proper doctrine and tactics maximize weapon effectiveness. Soviet assault tactics were developed specifically around the PPSh-41's capabilities. The weapon and tactics worked together to create combat effectiveness. The human stories behind the PPSh-41 are compelling. Georgy Shpagin, the designer, worked tirelessly during the war. He continued improving the design based on battlefield feedback. He received the Stalin Prize for his contribution to Soviet victory. After the war, he continued working on firearms design until his death in 1952. His legacy lives on in every PPSh-41 that still exists today. The factory workers who built millions of these weapons have their own stories. Many were women who took over when men went to fight. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer during critical periods. They knew every weapon they made could save a Soviet soldier's life. This motivation drove them to work through exhaustion and hardship. The soldiers who carried these weapons into battle each have their stories too. Veterans who survived the war often kept photographs of themselves with their PPSh-41. They would tell their families about the weapon that protected them. Some veterans requested to be buried with photographs showing them holding their PPSh-41. The bond between soldier and weapon was that strong. In modern firearms collecting, the PPSh-41 has a special status. Collectors seek original wartime examples for their historical significance. Factory markings tell the story of where and when each weapon was made. Some weapons have been recovered from battlefields decades later. Battlefield excavations in Russia still uncover PPSh-41s, buried since the 1940s. Even after 80 years underground, some are restored to working condition. This durability amazes modern firearms experts. The economic impact of PPSh-41 production was substantial. Soviet factories employed hundreds of thousands producing these weapons. The raw materials required were enormous steel, wood, chrome for barrel lining, but the efficient design meant materials were used optimally. Less waste meant more weapons from the same resources. The cost-effectiveness compared to Western weapons was striking. For the cost of one Thompson submachine gun, the Soviets could make 40 PPSh-41s. This economic advantage translated directly into battlefield superiority. The PPSh-41's role in specific operations deserves highlighting. During the Battle of Moscow in winter, 1941-42, Soviet counter-offensive troops were increasingly armed with PPSh-41s. These weapons proved crucial in forest fighting around the capital. German troops were pushed back, partly due to Soviet close-range firepower superiority. The siege of Leningrad saw extensive PPSh-41 use. Defenders used them to repel German attacks on the encircled city. Urban defense favored the high-capacity automatic weapon. Some PPSh-41s were even manufactured inside besieged Leningrad. This demonstrated the design's manufacturing simplicity. During Operation Bagration in summer 1944, the massive Soviet offensive, Soviet infantry armed with PPSh-41s advanced rapidly through Belarus. The weapon's reliability in summer dust and heat was proven. Tank riders carried PPSh-41s as their primary weapon. This allowed rapid exploitation of breakthroughs in German lines. The final assault on Berlin showcased the PPSh-41 in its ideal environment. Urban warfare at close range, building to building, room to room. Soviet assault groups would clear entire blocks with PPSh-41 firepower. The 71-round drum meant fewer pauses to reload during building clearing. German defenders, many with bolt-action rifles, couldn't match this firepower. The photograph of Soviet soldiers raising the flag over the Reichstag. Several soldiers in that iconic image are carrying PPSh-41s. The weapon was there at the symbolic end of the war in Europe. The technical evolution during production is interesting to examine. Early 1942 production weapons had higher quality finish. Bluing was more complete, wood stocks were better finished. As the war progressed and production increased, finish quality decreased. By 1943, many PPSh-41s had rough finishes and simpler stocks. But functionality never decreased. If anything, it improved. Manufacturing shortcuts actually enhanced reliability in some cases. Late-war PPSh-41s were more durable than early examples. The Soviets learned from field reports and continuously improved production. Small changes in the stamping dies improved strength. Welding techniques were refined for faster, stronger joints. This continuous improvement kept the design relevant throughout the war. The ammunition production to feed millions of PPSh-41s was staggering. Soviet factories produced billions of 7.62 by 25 mm rounds. Entire factories were dedicated just to ammunition production. The logistics of distributing this ammunition to the front was complex. Train loads of ammunition moved continuously toward combat zones. This logistical effort enabled the PPSh-41's battlefield effectiveness. Without ammunition, even 6 million weapons would be useless. The Soviet system ensured ammunition reached the soldiers who needed it. Comparing the PPSh-41 to modern submachine guns shows its lasting influence. Modern submachine guns still follow many principles established by the PPSh-41. High-capacity magazines, simple blowback operation, compact size. The Uzi submachine gun, designed in Israel in the 1950s, shares these features. The MP5, designed in Germany in the 1960s, refined these concepts. Modern submachine guns are more accurate and refined. But the basic doctrine of overwhelming close-range firepower remains. The PPSh-41 proved this concept in the most brutal testing ground imaginable, the World War II Eastern Front. For students of military history, the PPSh-41 offers valuable lessons. It shows that war drives innovation in unexpected ways. Desperate circumstances produce creative solutions. It demonstrates that industrial capacity matters as much as tactical skill. The nation that can produce more weapons has a significant advantage. It proves that reliability matters more than complexity. A simple weapon that always works beats a complex weapon that sometimes fails. It shows that doctrine and equipment must match. Soviet assault tactics were built around the PPSh-41's capabilities. This synergy created battlefield effectiveness greater than the sum of parts. The legacy of the PPSh-41 extends far beyond its service life. It changed how armies think about infantry armament. Before the PPSh-41, most armies issued rifles to the majority of infantry. Automatic weapons were limited to specialists and support troops. The PPSh-41 proved that mass-issuing automatic weapons was viable. This led directly to the assault rifle concept, modern infantry, where every soldier has an automatic weapon. This traces back to Soviet experiences with the PPSh-41. The weapon also influenced how nations approach wartime production. The emphasis on simple, mass-producible designs This became standard for military procurement during conflicts. Complexity is the enemy of mass production. The PPSh-41 proved that simple designs can be highly effective. In popular culture, the PPSh-41 has become iconic. Any film or game depicting the Eastern Front features this weapon. Its distinctive silhouette with the drum magazine is instantly recognizable. It represents Soviet determination and industrial might. Historical reenactors prize PPSh-41 replicas for authenticity. The weapon has become a symbol of the Great Patriotic War, as Russians call World War II. In Russian military museums, the PPSh-41 holds a place of honor. It's displayed alongside T-34 tanks and Katyusha rockets. These are the weapons that turned the tide against Nazi Germany. Veterans who visit these museums often stop longest at the PPSh-41 displays. They remember the weight of the weapon, the sound of it firing. They remember when it saved their lives, or the lives of their comrades. These personal memories keep the weapon's story alive. The technical documentation of the PPSh-41 is extensive. Soviet military manuals detailed every aspect of the weapon: maintenance procedures, disassembly instructions, troubleshooting guides. These manuals were translated into multiple languages as the weapon spread globally. Today, these manuals are valuable historical documents. They provide insight into Soviet military training and doctrine. The illustrated guides show soldiers exactly how to operate the weapon. The simplicity of the instructions reflects the simplicity of the design. No Soviet soldier with basic literacy could learn to maintain the weapon. This accessibility was crucial, given the Soviet Union's diverse population. Soldiers from across the vast Soviet territory could all use the same weapon. The standardization simplified training and logistics enormously. The sound of the PPSh-41 deserves final mention. Veterans describe it as a distinctive rapid chatter. At 900 rounds per minute, individual shots blur together. The sound was different from other weapons of the era. German soldiers could identify PPSh-41 fire by sound alone. That sound meant Soviet troops were close, very close. In the ruins of Stalingrad or Berlin, that sound echoed through the streets. It became the soundtrack of Soviet victory. For Soviet soldiers, the sound of their own PPSh-41s was reassuring. It meant they had firepower, they had a chance. That sound accompanied them from Moscow to Berlin. So what's the final verdict on the PPSh-41? By any measure, it was one of the most successful firearms in history. Over 6 million produced, service in conflicts spanning 50 years, used by dozens of nations on every continent. It achieved everything its designer intended. Cheap to manufacture, simple to operate, reliable in any condition. Devastating in close combat, effective in the hands of minimally trained soldiers. It helped turn the tide of World War II on the Eastern Front. It gave Soviet soldiers the firepower to match and exceed their enemies. It proved that mass production and simple design could win wars. The PPSh-41 wasn't the most accurate weapon ever made. It wasn't the most powerful or the longest ranged. But it was exactly what the Soviet Union needed when they needed it most. In the desperate years of 1941 to 1945, millions of these weapons flooded the battlefield. They gave Soviet infantry the ability to fight back against the German invasion. That ability, multiplied across millions of soldiers, changed history. The drum-fed Soviet submachine gun that flooded urban combat with sheer volume of fire. The PPSh-41 wasn't just a weapon, it was a war-winning design. It was the sound of Soviet determination, 71 rounds at a time. And that is the complete story of one of history's most influential firearms.